You've ever wondered why that large coffee keeps winning? Even when the plan was to spend less, it doesn't happen by accident. That moment at a restaurant, staring at the menu, thinking a $40 steak suddenly feels reasonable. That's not hunger talking, that's design. Careful, calculated design. Because somewhere on that same menu, there's a $75 steak sitting quietly. Almost nobody orders it. It's not there to sell. It's there to influence, and it works. In fact, when businesses use this tactic correctly, it can increase sales of a specific item by up to 40%. That tactic is called the decoy effect. And once it becomes visible, it starts showing up everywhere. Picture this. A menu lands on the table. 3 wines, one at $18, one at $33, and one at $36. The cheapest feels basic, the most expensive feels excessive, but that middle option? That suddenly feels like the smart move, balanced, reasonable, almost like a win. But here's the twist. That decision wasn't made in isolation. It was shaped by comparison. Because human brains don't naturally evaluate things in absolute terms. Nobody walks into a restaurant and instinctively knows what a steak or a glass of wine should cost. There's no internal price tag stored somewhere. Instead, everything gets judged relative to what sits next to it. And that's exactly where the trap begins. The decoy effect works by introducing a third option that shifts perception. Not by forcing a choice, but by quietly rearranging how the choice feels. That third option is never meant to be chosen. It's designed to lose. But in losing, it makes another option look like a clear winner. That's what psychologists call asymmetric dominance. One option is clearly better than another, but only when compared in a specific way. And once that comparison locks in, the brain stops asking the most important question. Not, do I need this? But which one is the better deal? That shift alone is where money starts slipping away. This isn't some recent trick either. The phenomenon was formally identified decades ago, with research in the early 1980s showing that introducing a decoy could dramatically shift consumer preferences. And since then, it hasn't just been used, it's been perfected. Take the classic subscription example. One option offers digital access for $59. Another offers print for $125. Most people would ignore print entirely. It feels outdated, overpriced. But then comes a third option. Print and digital together for $125. Same price as print alone. Suddenly, print only looks ridiculous. And the combo? That looks like a steal. So instead of paying $59, people jump to $125. Not because they needed more but because it felt like a smarter deal. In one famous case study, the majority of people originally chose the cheaper option. But once the decoy was introduced, 84% switched to the most expensive plan. Nothing about the product changed. Only the context did. That's the power of comparison. Restaurants have mastered this better than almost any other industry. Menus are carefully engineered environments. Every price, every placement, every option exists for a reason. That $75 steak isn't random. It's an anchor. Once it's seen, it resets expectations. Now $40 doesn't feel expensive anymore. It feels moderate, even affordable. Without that anchor, $40 might feel like a splurge. With it, it feels like restraint. And this isn't just about expensive items. The same structure shows up everywhere. 3 options. One slightly awkward, one clearly inferior in comparison, and one that suddenly feels like the obvious choice. That obvious choice is almost always the one the business wants sold. And it works because of something deeper than logic: loss aversion. The brain hates missing out on value. It doesn't like the feeling of leaving something on the table. So when a larger portion is just a little more expensive, choosing the smaller one starts to feel like a loss. Not spending extra starts to feel like wasting an opportunity. And that's how a $6 decision quietly becomes an $8 one. It's not about spending more, it's about avoiding the feeling of getting less. That subtle emotional shift is incredibly powerful. And it doesn't just stop at restaurants. Walk into a coffee shop. A small is $3.50. A medium is $4.25. A large is $4.75. That middle option exists for a reason. It's close enough to the large that the jump feels small, but far enough from the small that it nudges the decision upward. So instead of asking whether 4.75s is worth it, the brain compares $4.25 to $4.75, and suddenly the larger size feels like the smarter move, even if it wasn't needed, even if half of it ends up untouched. That's the illusion of value. And once it's understood, a pattern starts to appear everywhere. Streaming services offering basic, standard, and premium tiers, phone plans nudging upgrades, software subscriptions pushing higher packages. Even cars and real estate follow the same script. A slightly overpriced option sets the stage, a strategically placed middle option guides the decision, and a target option captures the sale. The structure rarely changes. Three choices, one designed to lose, one designed to win, and one designed to make the winner look irresistible. And the most interesting part? It never feels like manipulation. It feels like smart decision-making, like getting a better deal, like outsmarting the system. But in reality, the system was designed to produce that exact feeling. That's what makes the decoy effect so effective. It doesn't force decisions, it shapes them. And it does it so subtly that even when it's recognized, it still works. Because the instinct to compare doesn't disappear. Even with awareness, that pull toward the better deal remains. That's how deeply wired this behavior is. And it's happening constantly. Not once in a while. Not occasionally. Multiple times a week. Every menu. Every pricing page. Every upgrade screen. Small decisions stacking up quietly. An extra dollar here. $5 there. $10 on a meal that felt justified. Individually, none of it feels significant. But over time, it adds up in ways that are easy to underestimate. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable. That uncomfortable part shows up when the math is actually laid out, not in a dramatic way, but in the kind of quiet accumulation that doesn't feel dangerous in the moment. Because no single decision feels like a mistake. It feels justified. It feels small. It feels like getting better value. But take that restaurant example. Spending an extra $10 because something feels like a better deal doesn't sound like much. Do that twice a week, which is completely normal for eating out or ordering in, and that becomes $20 a week. Over a year, that's $1,040. And that's just from one category. That's just from food. That doesn't include coffee upgrades, subscriptions, tech purchases, or all the other places where the same pattern quietly repeats itself. Now layer in something like coffee. Choosing the larger size because it's only a little more adds around $1.25 each time. Do that a few times a week, and suddenly there's close to $200 a year going toward coffee that was never actually needed. Add streaming services where a basic plan would have been enough, but a premium tier felt like a smarter choice. That can easily add another $300 a year. Then phone plans, gym memberships, software upgrades, all nudged slightly higher than necessary. And before long, without any single dramatic purchase, that number crosses $2,000 a year. Quietly, consistently, almost invisibly. Stretch that across a decade, and it's tens of thousands. Stretch it across a lifetime, and it becomes something much bigger. Money that could have been saved, invested, or used intentionally ends up being redirected by tiny, repeated nudges in decision-making environments that were never neutral to begin with. And what makes this even more powerful is that these decisions rarely feel wrong. They feel optimized, efficient, rational. Like getting the most out of the money being spent. That's the illusion. The feeling of gaining value replaces the awareness of spending more. Because the brain isn't calculating absolute worth. It's comparing differences. It's looking for relative advantages. And when something appears to dominate another option, when it looks clearly better for a slightly higher price, it triggers a sense of certainty. A sense that the right choice is obvious. That's asymmetric dominance doing its job. One option is positioned so that another one looks undeniably superior. And once that comparison locks in, everything else fades into the background. The original plan, the actual need, the intended budget, all of it becomes secondary. And that's where anchoring quietly reinforces the effect. The highest price on the menu sets the tone. It establishes what expensive looks like in that moment. Once that anchor is in place, everything below it feels more reasonable, even if it's still objectively high. So a $75 steak makes a $40 steak feel like restraint. A $200 bottle of wine makes an $80 one feel accessible. Not cheap, but acceptable, justified. And that shift doesn't happen through logic. It happens instantly, automatically, through what psychologists describe as fast, intuitive thinking. That fast system isn't built to analyze every decision deeply. It's built to conserve energy, to make quick judgments using shortcuts. And the decoy effect is perfectly designed to exploit those shortcuts. It combines contrast, comparison, and loss aversion into a single moment of decision. The contrast makes one option look better next to another. The comparison shifts focus away from actual need. And loss aversion creates the feeling that choosing anything less is missing out. And once those elements come together, the outcome feels almost inevitable. But there's another layer to this that makes it even more subtle. The idea that the middle option feels safe. When three choices are presented, there's a natural pull toward the one that doesn't feel too cheap or too excessive. It feels balanced, sensible, like the kind of decision a rational person would make. Businesses understand this deeply. That's why the structure is often designed so that the target option sits right in that middle position, even if it's not actually moderate in absolute terms. It's framed as the compromise, even when it's closer to the high end. And sometimes, the strategy flips. Instead of pushing the middle, the design pushes the premium. In that case, the decoy sits very close to the top price, but offers noticeably less value. That makes the jump to the highest option feel small, almost negligible. So instead of asking whether the premium option is necessary, the brain focuses on how little extra it costs compared to something that's clearly worse. That's how upgrades happen, not because of need, but because of proximity. And this pattern repeats across industries because it works. It's predictable, reliable, measurable. Studies have shown that introducing a decoy can increase the selection of a target product by up to 40%. That's not a small shift. That's a massive change in behavior driven entirely by how options are presented. Nothing about the product changes. Only the context does. And that's what makes this less about individual decisions and more about environments. Because most choices don't happen in isolation. They happen inside systems that are designed to guide outcomes. Meanness, pricing pages, subscription tiers, all of them are structured experiences. And within those structures, certain paths are made to feel more natural than others. So the question isn't whether the decoy effect exists. It's how often it's influencing decisions without being noticed. And more importantly, how to step outside of it. Because awareness alone helps, but it's not always enough. That instinct to compare, to optimize, to avoid missing out, it doesn't disappear just because the mechanism is understood. It needs to be replaced with something more deliberate. The first shift is isolation. Looking at an option on its own, separate from everything around it. Instead of asking which one is better, the question becomes whether that single option is worth its price. No comparisons, no reference points, just a direct evaluation. Then comes detection, recognizing the pattern itself. Three options where one feels awkward or unnecessary, one that seems clearly inferior to another. That's usually the decoy. Once it's identified, its influence weakens. After that, there's anchor destruction, actively questioning the highest price instead of accepting it as a reference point. Just because something is listed at $75 doesn't mean it defines what's reasonable. It's just a number placed there to shape perception. And finally, strategic delay, slowing down the decision just enough to interrupt the automatic response. Because most of these choices are made quickly, almost reflexively, creating a pause allows the original intention to come back into focus. Because at the core of all this, there's a simple truth that gets lost in comparison. Value isn't about getting more for slightly more money. It's about getting exactly what's needed, and nothing beyond that. And that's where one line cuts through all of it. Price per ounce, price per feature, price per upgrade. None of that can actually be saved. Only dollars can. Spending more to get a better ratio doesn't mean saving. It just means spending more. And once that distinction becomes clear, the entire structure starts to look different. The large coffee isn't a better deal if the extra goes to waste. The premium plan isn't smarter if the features aren't used. The more expensive meal isn't justified just because something above it made it feel reasonable. Because outside of the comparison, those decisions stand on their own. And when they do, a lot of them stop making sense. That's the moment where control shifts back. Not by avoiding spending, not by eliminating choices, but by stepping out of the frame those choices were designed in, and deciding based on need, not comparison. Because the decoy effect only works when the comparison is accepted. You remove that, and the entire illusion collapses. And suddenly, the smartest choice isn't the one that looks like the best deal. It's the one that was actually needed in the first place. If this changed the way everyday decisions are seen. Hit subscribe and stick around, because there's a lot more happening behind simple choices than it seems.